Hey, I know this is weird. Since I spent so much time talking about you, I wanted to talk about me for a minute. And me is a name my family called me Steve most of the time. And I still refer to myself as Steve. I mean, I know my name is Steve and that was my given name. You know, parts of me are different than you. And I'm going to talk about Stevie too. That was what they called me when I was a little boy, the half breed. But that's after I get done talking about me. That part of me was the defiant one, Steve, and not afraid to take risks and do crazy things. Not afraid to love, not afraid to cry, not afraid to forgive, much like you, but different in a way. Steve always rescued his family. He was always there, could talk to his family, relied on them, forgave them when they hurt Steve, and so the difference between you, Stephen, and Steve is that Stephen grew up. And Steve is still struggling with, or me is still struggling with issues of what he did to Steve himself and isn't able to move past that without some guidance. And passive aggressive behavior. Oh man, did I know that? But I got the point across sometimes. Passive aggressive behavior. You know, either it was like, please help me, or look what I'm doing in order for you to see me as me, Steve. Steve had, you know, ups and downs all of the time. You know, Steve turned to, unlike Steven, Steve turned to drugs and alcohol to hide his feelings or to express them. And I don't want others to do that. Don't follow that. So, yeah, Steve was, and I look at those stages of development being Stevie, Rebel, um, Steve, and then Steven, and then I already know where this development is coming over here. I know where that is, and I'm already there. It's just I gotta talk about these other things first. So, like, and Steve was a little bit more reluctant to talk about sexuality, a little bit shyer. And it wasn't that he was afraid of the sexuality, it was that he didn't think it was anybody's business. Because he didn't go around asking, well, who are you sleeping with? You know? Steven doesn't either. Steven's like, if you're sleeping with, whoever, just, I don't care. And Steve didn't care either at the time, but he was a little bit more shy about his own. And I don't know if it was shyness that kept him from talking about it, or the fact that it was like, how many times does somebody come up to you and just say, hey, I just slept with so and so last night? Especially if they're of the opposite sex or the same sex. And they'd be like, well, that was out of the blue. you know. One thing about Steve was, and it still is true about Steven, is that serial monogamy is important, or a connection with people is important, or others. So, and that was more important, I think, it still is important to Steve and Steven, is that it was more about the inner beauty of a person than the outward appearance are the physical characteristics of their sex organs, or and that's not always easy for other people to understand. It's like, well, what do you mean? You people always said, well, you looked into people's souls and you saw what kind of people they were. Even if they were bad people, you still saw something in them that could be different. And I said at one time, I changed people just by being around them or just by talking. And I hope that can be some kind of healing lesson. Like, look at yourself and see those parts of yourself, the child, the adolescent, the adult, and as it progresses, you change. I changed from Stevie to Steve to Steven, or little me, or little I, to Steve, me, and then bigger me, and now Steven, you, and you still have the little you and the big you in you. And we're working on that. We're trying to get rid of some of this. And not get rid of it. No, I shouldn't say get rid of it, but understand it better. Steve was really complicated. And I don't think a lot of people in his family understood him very well. I mean, my sisters were, one was a fixer, and the other one was, well, she left me. And so one took on responsibilities above what she needed to fix herself, and the other was like, I can't do this right now because I need to concentrate on myself. So one was involved overly in Steve's life and me, and the other one was, I'm going to just back away and work on myself now for a while. And so it's funny talking about me is that I always, and in those little, I mean, there's always I in there. I you, I me, I little you, and me. So Steve was really like dug himself into education and tried to better himself all the time and strived and strived and strived, and then quit doing things like right at the last minute, or started new projects. And he had sight about, and he knew that he had, sight about, like, well, this is just not going to work. I got to get out of this. And that's what Steve did. Or when I was digging through genealogies and looking for family histories, I had this panicked feeling as Steve, as me, that I needed to get this done. This needed to get done. And I would stand in front of that scanner, and I don't want anybody else to do that, unless you want to. But I compiled records so that I understood a little bit about where I came. And I talked about in the other video about the connections between Hallquist, Lindquist, and Holland. If you take the names, Sean says, well, you're just piecing words together. And I think it's more than that. And, and again, if you don't believe me, then disprove me, which is not my burden. It's theirs to disprove me. And it wasn't ever Steve's trial when I was Steve. It was, I think it was me struggling against rules to find myself in my own world, like where I fit in. And sometimes that meant leaving relationships as Steve that were going nowhere, or like he felt like he was suffocating in, that he needed to be more. He was like, I want to go travel. I want to go do something. I want to go explore the world, or I want to. And some of his inward, some of me, my inward like paths led me to certain things that were going to happen. Um, and there's one more aspect of my life, and I would say that is that duality, and that was that feminine side that really got people like that. People used to say, well, you have the heart of a woman and the mind of a maniac. you know, I suppose it was because all those women in my life that took care of me and that I helped so much and that I understood really well. I was in touch with my feelings at such an early age because they taught me to talk about them all the time from when I was a little boy. And so, yeah, it was interesting. It was interesting other people's reactions because they were like, oh, I thought you were gay, or oh, I thought you were straight, or are you bisexual, or are you. And I'd be like, I don't, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm like, what are you? You know? No, I would say that to them. I'd be like, what are you? I mean, what do you want to classify yourself as something just so other people feel comfortable around you? Steve was like, and Stephen is the same way. I don't. Stephen doesn't say, "Oh, I'm gay," or "I'm straight," or "I'm bisexual." He just says, "I'm sexual." You know. So yeah, yeah. Steve was, or me as Steve. I wasn't always nice to me. I wasn't, and I was hard on myself. And I learned that from my grandma. Well, and I learned that because I was like, I'm gonna prove. Harold had once said, "Those kids are never gonna amount to anything. They're throwaway kids." My grandma was like, there are no throwaway kids in my world. And I believe that. So, yes, I was hard on Steve as growing up. And I didn't become Steve until they called me Stevie until I was like done with school. And then when I went to college, it was like, oh, hey, Steve. And I didn't become Steven until like a year ago or a while ago. Interesting, too. As Steve or as me, I always knew that there was an easier way to do it. I could be truthful, or I could be less confusing for people as Steve. But that wasn't my path at that time. And I think those things taught me something. And looking back on it, then I can see, well, it taught me how to change into Stephen, who's not afraid to talk about anything, even if others don't believe him. You know, I know, I look at myself and I'm like, whoa, with my glasses off. And it's okay. I mean, they can believe anything they want about me or you or the little I that I was. And I'll talk about Stevie in a while in a different video. And I'll air all three of them. I don't know. And, the other thing about Steve is that he had deep connections and love for the people he was in relationships with. And so does Steven. Steve is just, you know, broke his back to please his partner and so that's me as Steve would be like, crazy, just you know. And I did a lot of things I gardened. I was crazy about gardening and taking care of the earth and like working at co-ops and health food and like aromatherapy, and I learned about herbs and like medicinal herbs. I learned how to make extracts and tinctures, and you know, and I learned what you use to make them with, and I learned alternative methods of making them. There's so many medicines that were easy to use, and people, well, pharmaceutical companies at that time, and Steve knew it. It was just like, oh, they're gonna make a whole bunch of money, you know, and get people hooked on pharmaceutical drugs. And not that I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm saying that, like I talked about the other day with ADHD, that there were alternative treatments. And a lot of what Steve did when he went to treatment and when he was using drugs is he was terrified of sleeping in his bedroom for some reason. He just could not sleep in there. So he slept on the couch when he was living in Golden Valley. And drank and drank and felt so much and purged all the and went through those old memories, and it was like a floodgate of old memories that he didn't really need to look at, but I felt compelled to do it for him. And it wasn't easy. And he knew that there was an end point to his drug use. I mean, he had seen it already. He saw it himself. He was like, I already know when the end of it's going to happen. And it did. And he pretty much knew how it was going to end. Like, this is what he was going to do. And it was going to be like, oh, okay, well. So it's really hard, kind of. At one time I said I cried for Stevie, and I hadn't done that in such a long time, and I cried for that little boy. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And so that was really hard. And I think if you can look at, well, if you're looking at addiction to anything, you know, and people are like, well, addiction to like internet and social media. I'm not saying change your behavior. There's a place for it. Other people would be like, oh, you spend too much time on the internet. And you know what? That's my outlet right now. I'm not one of those people that say, don't do the internet. You know, I'm not one of those people that say, put out messages that say, there's too much information on the internet, and they use the internet to do it. You know, I'm like, you want to use the internet? You know, I also believe that communing with nature, and Steve did too. He was very good about caring for roses and, you know, creating. I know he was kind of crazy. Well, not really. He would always make little gardens for, well, for other beings to like hide in, you know, or just, I know, like little shelters under some little, I, don't, I know, Steve was an amazing man. And he's still there. That me inside of you, he's still there. It's just, we're just changing from that evolution of me into Stephen, and that is still, I'm still creating Stephen as we talk. And I think that talking about Steve, me as Stephen, or as Steve, helps Stephen move forward to where he's going. So, it's weird. I was writing about, you know, I always made those wreaths, you know, out of vines. And I would go into I would just either take it off the fence, and I'd always be like, can I have that, please? No, do you mind? And, you know, and of course it was just like, go ahead, take it. And so I was thinking, I made a wreath for Sabea. And I never needed to learn how to make them. I always knew how to make them. And I made some for another statue that I had a long time ago. And I made some for nature that I just left outside. And I was pretty careful about it. I made some large ones. I made several. I made some for family. Of course, for Sabea, I didn't make Mia one. I think maybe I did. She had a different kind of, I just, some of my pictures of Mia are missing. I said I would never separate those two. They stay with Stephen or they won't be separated. They'll learn one day how nice Steve was, and Stephen is. Back to me. The Steve that was me. Question. I still do. But I did question a lot. I came to terms with, as Steve, I came to terms with, I came to terms with him a long time ago. And I would hope if there's any other me's that you can be like, oh, now I can finally be free. I mean, just be like, oh, thank you. That is a good way to look at it. Like, I am changing from me to the you I could be, and I can understand now that these developmental phases of me to you are just phases, and that they do get better. And sometimes getting rid of those, or not getting rid of the inner demons, but going, that's what it's from. And not always easy. And I think wise men and gentlemen understand that they understand. Well, and it's hard to come to terms with it sometimes, but they understand hearts of gold and the ability to transform energy from that heart of gold into creation and into new beings as you go on your journey. And so that's kind of what Steve did. And I correct my family now when they call me Steve. And I catch myself. I'm like, when I talk to myself, and I do that frequently, or I talk to Bailey and Hugo, I'm like, well, Steve, you... And I'm like, well, quit doing that. You're Steven, But I suppose that's Steve breaking through, going, I still have a voice, And it might be like the voice from the past, but he still sometimes comes into my consciousness, and he's like, hey, don't do that, or do that, or be wild, or, And then I'm like, Steve, we've talked about this. I know you guys are thinking I'm crazy. Disprove me, though, or disprove you. That's what they have to do. They have to disprove that me was there and you were there. And that they'll never be able to do. So, okay, well, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about Stevie, which might be a little bit longer topic since he was kind of crazy and cute and super cute. I'll show you a couple pictures of me as the little me, the child in me. And that child in me, well, we'll talk about it in a minute.